On a lonely Christmas Eve, a hungry mail-order bride finds more than a meal when the rancher offers her his plate. What starts as survival turns into a spark of hope and unexpected connection. The cold wind bit at her cheeks as the young mail-order bride stepped off the creaking wagon, her hands trembling from exhaustion and nerves. The snow crunched beneath her boots, and each breath formed tiny clouds in the frosty air she had traveled. For days across plains and forests, leaving behind the only life she had ever known, carrying nothing but a small bundle of belongings and the hope that somewhere ahead a new beginning awaited her. The ranch appeared distant and imposing, its wooden. Fences dusted with snow and the faint glow of candlelight from the windows offered a fragile promise of warmth and shelter. Yet her stomach tightened with hunger and her heart ached with uncertainty. She approached the heavy front door and knocked, her knuckles raw from travel and fatigue. The sound echoed through the empty halls, and for a moment she feared there would be no answer. The air inside smelled of wood smoke and cold earth, and though the house was modest, it carried a sense of life and history that both intimidated and comforted her. She hesitated on the threshold, wondering if she had made a mistake, if this new life was truly meant for her. The hours of travel and the loneliness of the journey pressed down on her, and she felt the weight of every choice that had led her to this moment. The rancher emerged from the shadows of the hallway, a tall man with a reserved expression and eyes that seemed to measure her silently. She lowered her gaze and offered a tentative greeting, her voice barely above a whisper, yet she could sense the scrutiny and the distance between them. The house was quiet, except for the crackle of the fire in the hearth, and the faint ticking of a clock on the wall and the hush of winter. Outside, the rancher moved with deliberate calm and spoke in a measured tone that revealed little of his thoughts or feelings. The bride followed him into the kitchen where a small table was set. But no food awaited her, and the sight made her chest tighten with a pang of despair. She had imagined this night differently, dreaming of a meal, a warm welcome, and perhaps a flicker of companionship. Yet the reality was stark and unyielding. Her fingers clutched the folds of her worn shawl, and she tried to steady her breathing as the firelight danced across the wooden walls, casting shadows that seemed to stretch long and lonely across the room. She imagined the family celebrating without her, their laughter and chatter. A distant echo that made the silence around her heavier. She felt the sting of being unwanted and the sharp edge of isolation in a place that was supposed to be her new home. Yet beneath the fear and discomfort, there was a flicker of resilience, a determination to endure, to prove her worth, to survive, and to find a place in this cold and unfamiliar world. She pressed her lips together and drew in a deep breath, steeling herself for the night ahead. The long hours of darkness would be testing, and her body ached with hunger. Yet she refused to give in to despair. She would face this night with quiet dignity and hope that somewhere in the shadows of the ranch and the uncertainty of the evening, a glimmer of warmth would find her and carry her into the promise of tomorrow. The night grew colder as the young bride moved quietly through the ranch, trying to find a corner where she could rest her aching body. Her hands ached from carrying her few belongings, and her feet were stiff from hours of travel. Yet, she forced herself to stay alert. The shadows of the wooden beams and the flickering firelight made the house feel both alive and empty. At the same time, she watched the rancher move about with practiced ease, preparing his own modest meal, and the sight of food only deepened the gnawing ache in her stomach. She wanted to ask for a bite, but pride and fear held her back. She busied herself with small tasks, gathering firewood, sweeping the floor, and fetching water. She hoped that by showing diligence, she might earn his notice or some small kindness. Yet each gesture seemed to go unnoticed, and the weight of loneliness pressed heavier on her chest. She found a small chair near the hearth and settled there, trying to stay warm and thinking of the journey that had brought her here. The snow outside whispered against the windows, and the wind howled across the plains, making the house feel even more isolated. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and watched the rancher with quiet longing. wishing for even a simple word or smile that would bridge the gap between them. She imagined sitting at the table sharing the meal, and perhaps a conversation, a fleeting dream that seemed almost impossible. Yet she held on to it as a thread of hope. The hours passed slowly, the flickering fire casting shadows that danced across the walls and floor, and she felt the sting of hunger in her belly, each pang a reminder of her vulnerability and the harshness of her new reality, she thought. Of her family left behind and the life she had given up to come here, and a wave of doubt washed over her. Yet she forced herself to focus on the small moments she could control, tending to the fire, arranging the dishes, cleaning the floor. Each act, a testament to her will to survive and to be seen. Despite the cold and quiet, she felt a subtle shift in the rancher's demeanor, a glance that lingered, a nod of acknowledgement, a faint smile that made her heart flutter with cautious hope. She wondered if he sensed her hunger and loneliness, if he recognized the courage it had taken to arrive here alone on this cold Christmas Eve. She pressed herself closer to the fire, feeling the warmth seep into her bones, and imagined a world where kindness might still exist, a world where she could belong and be more than a shadow in a stranger's house. The night stretched on with its quiet challenges and small glimmers of possibility, and she clung to the hope that by morning something would change, that the simple act of sharing a meal might bridge the distance between them and transform her loneliness into connection, and perhaps even the first spark of trust and understanding that could shape her future on the ranch. Morning light seeped through the frost-covered windows, casting pale beams across the wooden floor, and the young bride stirred from a restless sleep. Her stomach ached, and the chill of the night still lingered on her skin. Yet there was a quiet determination in her movements as she rose to gather kindling and stoke the fire. The rancher moved beside her with calm efficiency, offering curt instructions and small gestures of guidance that she followed diligently, each task a silent conversation. Between them, a rhythm forming in the quiet of the kitchen. She watched him prepare the simple breakfast, the smell of cooking filling the air, and for the first time a glimmer of hope flickered in her heart. She realized that despite the distance between them, he had noticed her presence and her efforts, and though words were few, the acknowledgement was meaningful. She waited quietly for an invitation or a sign that she could join him. Yet he continued his work, as if testing her patience, and resolved the tension of uncertainty pressed on her. Yet she held herself steady, knowing that her dignity and perseverance mattered more than immediate comfort. She reminded herself of the long journey she had endured, the sacrifices she had made, and the courage it took to face this new life alone. She set the table hesitantly, laying out what little she could contribute, her hands trembling as she did so. The rancher glanced at her finally and nodded, a small gesture that spoke volumes of recognition and perhaps even respect. Her heart leapt, but she kept her composure as the fire crackled softly in the background, warming the room and softening the harsh edges of reality. The morning progressed with careful movements and tentative conversation, questions exchanged in soft tones, stories of distant towns and travels, and in these moments of shared effort and small talk, a fragile connection began to take root between them. She noticed the way his eyes lingered briefly on her, faced the slight relaxation of his posture when she laughed quietly at a minor mishap in the kitchen, and the subtle ease in his gestures that suggested the beginnings of trust and familiarity. The air seemed lighter, the house warmer, and the weight of loneliness she had carried for so long lifted just slightly. She felt a tentative comfort in knowing that the rancher might offer more than mere tolerance, that his gestures could evolve into kindness and the possibility of companionship, and for the first time that morning she imagined a Christmas shared with someone who could see her not as an outsider but as a person worthy of care and recognition. The simple act of preparing and sharing breakfast became a bridge, a small but meaningful step toward connection, and she clung to the hope that the day would unfold with further gestures that could transform her lonely night into a memory of warmth and understanding. that might carry her through the challenges to come as the morning sun climbed higher. The rancher finally turned to her with a softer expression, his hands still busy with the simple chores of the household. Yet his eyes held an unspoken question. She met his gaze cautiously, unsure what to expect. The tension of days spent in quiet observation and small gestures of effort reached a turning point when he motioned for her to sit beside him at the modest table. The warmth from the fire reached across the room and seemed to soften the edges of their distance. The meal before them was humble bread and roasted vegetables and a bit of stew. Yet to her it felt like a feast, a lifeline extended in the simplest and most profound way. She hesitated only briefly before accepting the invitation the rancher offered. A piece of bread with a quiet smile, and she took it with gratitude, her heart pounding in a mixture of relief and anticipation as they began to eat. He spoke in a low, calm voice, telling fragments of his life on the ranch, stories of hardship and perseverance, tales of winters harsher than the one outside, and small anecdotes that brought a hint of laughter into the room. She listened intently, responding softly when prompted, and in those exchanges a subtle bridge formed between them. The silence that once felt heavy now carried a gentle rhythm of companionship with each shared morsel of food and each word spoken. The walls of the house seemed to shrink, and the distance between their hearts narrowed. She realized that his gesture was more than mere charity. It was a recognition of her presence and her worth, a signal that she belonged, at least for this moment, within the warmth of his home and the glow of the fire. The afternoon stretched into evening, and their conversation deepened, revealing common dreams and quiet fears. The rancher's reserved nature softened, and a mutual respect and understanding blossomed. The young bride felt a strange mixture of gratitude and hope. The loneliness that had weighed so heavily on her for weeks lifted just enough to allow the first flicker of trust to grow in her heart. She dared to imagine a life where moments like this could multiply, where the cold and isolation of the ranch could be softened by shared meals, conversation, and simple kindness. And in the quiet glow of that humble Christmas Eve meal, she sensed that the night had shifted from one of despair to one of possibility. A connection had been forged not through grand gestures, but through the quiet courage to offer and accept care and the unspoken promise that even in a harsh and lonely world, human warmth could still be found and shared. The evening settled over the ranch with a gentle hush, the firelight casting a warm glow across the wooden walls, and the young bride sat beside the rancher, her hands wrapped around a cup of steaming tea. The simple meal they had shared earlier had filled more than her empty stomach. It had begun to fill the emptiness she had carried for so long. The rancher's quiet presence beside her was no longer intimidating, but comforting, a steady anchor in a world that had seemed cold and unwelcoming. She noticed small changes in herself, a lightness in her step, a softening of the tension in her shoulders, and a flicker of hope in her heart. She dared to smile at the rancher, and he returned the gesture, a small but genuine smile that bridged the distance between them. They talked softly of Christmases past, of distant homes and forgotten traditions, sharing memories that felt both foreign and familiar. Laughter slipped between them, delicate and tentative yet honest, and healing the room seemed, warmer than the fire alone could make. As they cleaned the table together, she felt a sense of belonging she had never imagined possible on this remote ranch. The night deepened, and snow fell silently outside, blanketing the world in quiet white. And inside the house, the air was filled with a newfound sense of connection. The bride realized that the simplest acts of kindness could reshape hearts and build bridges where loneliness had once reigned. She sensed that the rancher's offer of his meal had been more than sustenance. It had been an invitation into his world, a gesture of trust and respect that opened the door to friendship and perhaps something deeper. Her thoughts turned to the days ahead, the challenges of a new life. On the ranch now seemed less daunting with this bond forming between them. She felt courage to face the hardships, to learn the rhythms of the land, and to carve out a place for herself in this new home, as the fire burned low and the night grew. Still, they shared a quiet moment of reflection, a mutual acknowledgement that Christmas had brought an unexpected gift, not wrapped in paper or ribbon, but in the warmth of human kindness and understanding. The young bride felt a peace settle in her, chest a soft glow of hope that for the first time in her life she had found someone who saw her and valued her, and she knew that this Christmas Eve would remain in her memory as the night when hunger and loneliness were replaced with connection, trust, and the fragile but beautiful beginnings of a new life together.